Good evening, folks. My name is Jagdish Krishnaswamy. I'm with the School of Environment and Sustainability at the Indian Institute for Human Settlements. Welcome to the public's talk here. And we have had quite a bit of attention on a small set of islands in recent weeks, the Lakshadweep, and it also brought into discourse the concerns about the fragile ecology, the unique cultures and communities that live on all our islands, both Lakshadweep as well as Andaman and Nicobar. And in the past few years, there have also been concerns about development pathways that the future holds for these islands. And so it's with great pleasure that I am introducing our speaker today. Simron Singh is a professor and university research chair in the Faculty of Environment, University of Waterloo in Canada. Using the analogy that islands function like living organisms, he conducts socio-metabolic research to evaluate how small island economies utilize or metabolize materials, energy, water, and infrastructure. He investigates why and how these consumption patterns or island metabolism may accumulate socio-metabolic risk over time that increases their susceptibility to the challenges of climate change. He further analyzes how island economies can transition to a more sustainable circular resource use model, thereby bolstering their overall resilience to the impact of climate change. His research partnerships span island nations in the Caribbean, Mediterranean, and Asia-Pacific regions. He's the founder and lead of the research program Metabolism of Islands, the executive secretary of the International Society for Industrial Ecology. He chairs the inaugural board of Island Industrial Ecology within ISIE and co-chairs RISC-CAN, a global research and action network of Future Earth integrated research on disaster risk, the World Weather Research Program, and the World Climate Research Program. His research partnership spans island nations across the seas and oceans in the Caribbean, Mediterranean, and Asia-Pacific regions. And so I welcome Simranjit Singh, and we are in for a treat. If you have anything that you didn't know about our small islands, this is a perfect opportunity for us. So,
thank you, Jagdish, and the Institute here for Human Settlement. It's such a pleasure to be here at this place, which I've heard a lot about, and I have also known Aroma for so many years, and finally I get to visit this place. My first time in my memory in Bangalore as well, so I was here as a kid, but I don't have any memory of that. So really a pleasure, and I will indeed talk about islands as I have promised, and so, but before I talk about my current research, Jagdish, I should talk about a little bit of my journey, because often we talk about our research, but we don't really talk about the path or the researcher that shaped this journey. So and thank you for saying that, because it triggered my kind of memories to go back. And what people find interesting, I find interesting myself, that I have my first degree was in English literature. So I wanted to be a poet. So that was my first love, and so I can share with you that the poem that actually changed my life. So I was interested in reading all kinds of literature, and this poem was really striking. I don't know how many of you know this poem, The Scholar Gypsy by Matthew Arnold, written about 100 years ago. And in this poem, which is several pages long, and at one point I knew that by heart, so he talks about an Oxford scholar who is very dissatisfied with what he's learning within the walls of Oxford. Now imagine a few hundred years ago, you're being in Oxford, you're in the most prestigious universities and the center of learning, and this person feels totally dissatisfied with the knowledge that's being delivered. So he says, I'm just tired of knocking at this door. I think I need to leave and follow the gypsies, the nomads, because he believes that the nomads, gypsies, have that knowledge, that, that secret of life, that spark from heaven. And so he says he leaves Oxford. Who would leave Oxford, that? But he leaves Oxford to live with the gypsies, and he writes this beautiful poem about his journey with the gypsies. So I was struck, and so one day I was sitting in my, in the college courtyard, and my professor asked me, just say, what do you want to become? And the first thing that came out of my mouth was scholar gypsy. So you shouldn't say, I don't know, people say when you say things that happen, it did happen. And I went and lived 4 years with these nomads in the Indian Himalayas, and this is the Gujars. So some of you may have heard they were, at some point, they were being forced relocated from, their pastoral land, from the traditional lands, um, to resettle, because nomadism is a primitive way of life, so you must settle down in order to reap the benefits of development. So I got involved in this struggle and about this, conservation versus, right to livelihood, because the traditional homes was becoming a national park for tigers and for elephants. So obviously, people had to leave, and so this was this tension, and this was my entry into the whole idea of sustainability. So never heard of the word sustainability, but this is where also, this was in the 1990s, when we had just had the Rio Conference 1992. And so the Agenda 21 was being talked about, and the rights of indigenous people. So this tension was there. And I was this young scholar, wanted to be a scholar gypsy, and I find myself in this struggle, between conservation and livelihood. And so I wouldn't go into all those details, because that's not what I'm going to talk about. But I did live that dream of a scholar gypsy. Until today, when I start my teaching, or some of my lectures, I say my greatest teachers were these nomads and the indigenous people I have worked with. So a few years later, I had, by some accident, life is not always planned and things happen. So in April 1999, I ended up in the Nicobar Islands, which is, as you know, quite, is the farthest, or the, you can say the southernmost territory of India. It's quite far, and this is another journey. This was a much longer journey, and it was more than a decade, I would say about close to 15 years. So this was why I conducted extensive research among these communities. It took a long time to go to the islands, because you go to you need all the permissions and so on. Once you're there, you don't know when you can leave, because the shipping, everything is so unpredictable, the weather. So if you miss the ship, then you wait for another month. So so you spend months there. So I did spend, and in the meantime, I was doing my PhD at Lund University in Sweden, and I was living in Vienna in Austria. So I was coming once a year, spending a few months, going back. So 5 years passed, and I experienced the world's deadliest tsunami. And I was in India, and I was on the way to these islands, and this struck. So this was a situation I was in. I had spent 5 years with them. I had learned about their life. I knew people, established personal relationships, the stories, and it was a very important part of my life. I was living it every day, even when I was not there. And suddenly these islands are destroyed, and and then again, I had to step in, say, okay, I'm not an aid worker. I don't have experience for disaster management or relief, but what is my, this question about what's my role? Like, what's the role of a researcher? How can science help people in crisis? So this was the question I was asking myself, and of course, intuitively and ethically, you had to do something, So there was this big discussion between should I not, and should science be involved with communities, or do we have to remain objective observers? So while well, I decided, of course, that I want to go and help, irrespective of what people said. And so, Science did like a 4-page interview, and with this heading called "After the Tsunami: A Scientist's Dilemma." So this story was based on interviewing a number of people who knew me, asking whether whether indeed this was a role of science or not, and whether I was taking the right steps. So I will leave it up to you to read what people said about me. but it did start a conversation about the role of science. I was also subject of a film-length documentary called Aftermath: The Second Flood. So I was followed for 7 years by film crews, and was filmed about this whole situation on the islands. So, and this was covered very positively in Nature. So they wrote a review called "AIDS: Inconvenient Truth." So yeah, so I was talking today, and maybe at some point we have a chance to see that. So this kind of captures a very long journey, and also asks the question: what is good help, and how can science help people in crisis? So these are the two important questions that the film tries to answer, and also raises a lot of other questions. So that's been my journey, and of course, I don't want to talk only about catastrophes and the Gujars and the Nicobaris, but there was a place that I worked, which I really, really love, which is Samothraki in Greece since 2008, which is a beautiful island in the agency, and I've been involved for over a decade, conducting research with teams and co-organizing summer schools there. So I was there last summer as well, and again trying to understand islandness, island sustainability questions, and so as you can see that my work on the Nicobar Islands and in Greece, they prepared me for a very strong understanding, so I was kind of, so they helped me to develop a research program which I call the metabolism of islands. So I conduct socio-metabolic research, and I will talk more about that in a bit. So this program was shaped because of the work from the Nicobars and in Greece, and then over time it has now built in the Caribbean, in the Asia Pacific. So I'm collaborating with different island states, and so it's become a kind of not only like it's a kind of a commitment. It's a kind of a scientific, intellectual curiosity, but also a commitment, and the reason is this basically, because as over the years, the issue of islands and climate was not talked about, for a long time. It's very recent that people are recognizing the special vulnerabilities that islands face worldwide. So this is very recent. It's a few years old. But for the longest time I was working on islands, people were asking what's wrong with the islands, because the focus was so many on cities and other parts on coast. So islands were overlooked, and so but it took time. But today we are at that crossroad that the situation is pretty urgent. So this is the abstract that you may have looked at. So I've just highlighted a paragraph because I learned that the largest number of IPCC authors in India are right here in IIHS. So I said I have to quote the IPCC here. So, but obviously this is not very good news, because they're saying with high to medium confidence the multiple interrelated risks on SIDS. So SIDS is the small island developing states, and so there are impacts on populations, livelihoods, infrastructure, and all the critical resources, energy, materials, water. Basically, they are at risks. I'm like everything is a problem, on small islands. So today I'm going to talk about socio-metabolic risk. This is a concept that I have been working on. So through the socio-metabolic research, I kind of developed this field together with a core group of researchers, and was able to publish this very recently in a journal, the Environmental Research Letters, where we could put forward this hypothesis or the idea of the socio-metabolic risk. And this, any concept, any new, when you propose a new hypothesis, it takes years of empirical work to be able to make a point like that. So this concept that I'm going to present today is based on years of work, and so I will talk about the Caribbean cases. While some say that 1.5% degree warming is coming, but others say it's already there, right? So this was last week. After I had sent my abstract to you, I read this news saying that that we're already there. So now we don't have to discuss a little bit. We don't have to do kind of bean counting, but we are in a difficult situation. Whether it's a few more years or less, but we are not, we say tipping points will be reached, but I think, in my personal view, that we are already experiencing uh, those predictions, those projections we are already experiencing from all the news that we hear around us. So, um, so islands do face an existential crisis. Uh, it's also a justice issue. I mean, they are the least responsible. They are not the ones who are creating this problem. I mean, so I don't even talk about mitigation with them, because even if they shut down everything fossil fuel related, it's 1%. So what? Like, really. So that's not the point. But they are impacted most, and that's I think an environmental justice issue. Plus, in a resource-constrained environment, they have to thrive, not only survive, right? So we talk about oftentimes resilience, about survival, but it's more, to me, more about thriving rather than surviving. It's not just about that. So they have limited resources, space constrained. They need from the domestic environment they have limited supply. Also, the waste that's generated need to be managed on the island, because exporting waste elsewhere is very expensive, simply. So that resource is not there for the most part. They are also importing most of the goods, a high dependency on imports, because it's just cheaper. The economies of scale are different. For smaller populations, your own production, and so what also happens is that when they import stuff, because of transportation cost, the quality of the resources that also come in is very poor. So that's I'll talk about electronic waste, because that relates, and also the food. So because you want to save cost of transport, and like 80-90% of your resources come from outside. So for dependency is an issue, the quantity, but the quality is also an issue here. So another feature is the undiversified exports. So islands have historically, through the colonial experience, encounters, they have been put on a path of development that pushes them to into a certain type of economic niche. So oftentimes they are focusing on single crop for export. It could be sugarcane, coffee, or even superfoods now, like or mangoes, or certain types of grains, and so foods are becoming fancy. So using their warm climate to produce export commodity for export. So not for their own food security, but for export, or put all the resources for tourism. So what happens is that they kill the other industries. So the domestic industries, everything is killed. Agriculture is killed. Everything is just directed, funneled into single sector development, which creates high risk when there is disturbance in the system, in the environment, prices change, or anything like, during the pandemic, like tourism, island states were the most impacted. Aruba, like, they were the most impacted economically, because everything was from tourism. So suddenly for 2 years, and then they had to take loans and debt. And these debts don't come just like that. They are tied. These are conditional. So they put conditions. Okay, we'll give you money. So you got to change the structures. You got to allow more investors from our country. You got to increase tourism so you can repay your debt. So things like that. So this is also observed commonly on islands. And climate impacts are there. We often hear coastal communities island, they're constantly living in fear. When I was writing the project for Claire Recover, just during the writing phase, there were 2 disasters in the area from where our partners are based. 2 disasters, and there was disruption of the power supply. And you are trying to finish this proposal on island vulnerability and resilience, and our partners were out of electricity because they had cyclones and hurricanes. And when the damage comes, luckily you might survive, you might be okay, the hurricane comes and goes, but damages happen, and when they happen, they are many times the GDP. It's not 5%, 10%, it's 200 times the GDP, 300 times GDP. We know from Dominica and other countries that Hurricane Maria, had many times the GDP impact. And so everything comes to a standstill. If there is a disaster on an island, doesn't mean that one part of the island is functioning and the other one is recovering. No, the entire country shuts down. Everything shuts down. So, and it takes time to rebuild. You need materials. Firstly, you have disaster waste because all the damage you have to dump somewhere locally. Then you have to import a lot of construction materials to rebuild. First, take loans, and then they have a lot of fiscal, monetary obligations. And so, Caribbean has one of the highest debts in the world because of these type of situations. So islands are sites of multi-hazard risk and cascades. And one thing people ask, what is so unique about islands that's not about mainland, So there are many unique features. I mean, space constraint we talked about, it's there. Distance from the mainland is there, so there is a transport challenge, there is a cost challenge. There's also a geological and climate issue because they're very exposed to all these extreme events. But geologically, I mean, they might be formed from volcanoes, certain kind of materials, so they can only have a certain type of resource. So they don't have the diversity, the luxury of sourcing everything locally. So, but very interestingly, also that from a socio-ecological system perspective, and since you work here with SES, is that they are very tightly coupled. Island systems are very tightly coupled socio-ecological systems. So small events, single events, can set in motion a series of cascades. So it very quickly you do. Let's say you build something. There is soil sealing, flash floods. Because of extreme, the changes in the precipitation. Flash floods goes into the ocean. There's runoff. The marine system gets affected. The marine, affects the ecosystem health in the oceans, affects livelihood. So everything is very, very rapid. So, and they're amplified through these feedback loops. And so we have observed this in island systems that these cascades are very, very rapid because of the tight coupling. And so tipping points can be reached very, very quickly. But the good news is that you can also have positive, coupling as well. So you can also turn it around because of the positive. You can make positive change rather quickly. So here is another study which is again coming from it's a team, but you have one of people right here as a co-author, Simron Singh, and so they were looking at the constraints and limits to human adaptation. So there were some there was some analysis on islands, and they said that the islands face greater constraints, both hard and soft limits. So they have led to adaptation, and also these adaptation limits, they're coming from the interactions between numerous constraints that affect multiple sectors due to cross-sectoral nature of adaptation in these regions. So again, the idea of the tight coupling that I was talking about. So so there are because of that things. Yeah, so they have these very strong barriers. So as I mentioned, that positive tipping points can also be reached. Things don't always have to go downhill, but they can also go uphill if there is, if there is a strong change, if strong leadership. One policy can, kind of cascade to something very positive. So yeah, so I study island sustainability from a socio-metabolic perspective, and what does that mean? Meaning that that I see islands as an organism, like so just using this more like an analogy, and so maybe I can explain a little bit more that so just like this picture of a cow here, an animal kind of relies on the metabolic flows. So the cow will graze in the grass, take water, and then there is, outputs, outflows. So maybe there is milk, and there is, the waste. So they consume resources and they produce waste. So similarly, island systems, we treat them, socio-economic systems, could be islands, could be any other socio-economic system, that they also, depend on resources. They depend on materials, energy, water, different types of materials, biomass, fossil fuels, construction materials. And so what happens is that over time, there are these outflows, there can be exports, there'll be waste. Some waste stays on the island, some, well, for the most part here, some waste stays, but some goes into the ocean and, in the air, the emissions, so some of it becomes infrastructure. So when there is a input of materials, like food would be consumed, then there's a waste. But there is some materials like construction material that come and stay for much longer. They become part of the island system, and we call them stocks. When I use the word stocks, I'm referring to built environment. So interestingly, globally, and this is again very interesting kind of data. Globally, 75% of all global extraction either becomes new infrastructure, or it is used to maintain existing infrastructure, or to operate the existing infrastructure. 75%. That's a huge number. So if we are going to build if you're going to build an infrastructure, and then think about what type of infrastructure, you need to know whether you need to know that there will be a need for continued resources to operate and maintain them. It is not a one-time investment. So, but this has been increasing. So it was around like what you call 20% in 1900, and now it's around, as I said, 75% altogether. So. And and I must mention that this infrastructure that is being built is to deliver services like transport. You build roads, you build houses for living, you build an institution like this to conduct research, to educate people. If you build a waste treatment plant for providing hygiene, sanitation services. So any infrastructure that's built is to provide critical societal services. So there is this loop, with that. So we can say, kind of very simply, that socio-metabolic flows, they create, operate, and maintain society's material stocks, that is infrastructure, to provide the critical services. So this is a heuristic diagram of these arrows, and each of these arrows that you see, domestic extraction and the imports, and we quantify those. So we use different methods to quantify using industrial ecology approaches, material flow counting, energy flow, physical input-output, or also material stock analysis. And as you know, you've been there at Yale, so you probably heard that a lot of times. So we have been very good for doing the input side for the longest time. We have become better at looking at the outflows, the waste, and we're also becoming much better at doing the infrastructure, like the stock analysis, which is more recent on this side. So basically, what I do is, in case people do forget, is that there's an input, there's a put, and there's an output. So this is, in case you forget what is social metabolism, it is basically this. But only 25% of the global inputs become outputs within a year, as I mentioned. So I'm just kind of putting the figures around. So 25%. So how did that happen? From 20% of going into infrastructure, it's now 75%. But how are we using so many more resources for our stocks? So let me show you a simple example, also from an island. So as economies develop, and you must have observed things here as well, around you, they stimulate the demand for essential services. So as Bangalore become wealthier, more IT, the Silicon, hub, and demand for, we need better airport. We just got a beautiful airport now, and you want better roads, you want, people moving in, and you need homes for them, you need new neighborhoods, you need better services, better hospitals, more educational institutions. There's a demand for services, and these services can only be delivered by building stocks. There is no other way. You need to build the infrastructure for that. And these stocks require flows. So that's why when I was driving my first day, this metro that's being built, like I heard 5 years. So this is never ending, and it'll take another few years, I heard. So it's going to provide, but by the time it finishes, maybe the traffic situation has changed. So we don't know. But that's the demand, because the wealth is there, so services and all that. So an example from Ireland. So you see Maldives, in 50 years. You see how infrastructure changed over time, because Maldives was becoming a popular destination for tourism, for going diving, and as also the world was becoming wealthier, they wanted to go for tourism. And so places like Maldives, they attracted, and suddenly they started to build because they got the money. They started to build infrastructure. Now you can see there's not much space there, you see. So which system would require more flows? The system on the right. So it's not a one-time investment. You need more flows when you have more stocks. So there is a dynamic feedback loop here, and here is the system. You see, the more the services, the more the flows, the more the flows, the more stocks, the more the stocks, the more. You see, this becomes a feedback, a reinforcing loop, from a systems language, right? But nothing can grow forever, as we know, and so what we see here is this kind of dynamic that we see all over the world. So when we look at the infrastructure growth, stock growth, they are rapidly, that's on the rise. It's happening more in the transition countries and in the so-called developing economies, where in the Asia Pacific, or especially Asia, is rapidly growing infrastructure. So now going back to these patterns, as I said, nothing can grow infinitely, and so we are seeing a type of metabolic transition. Right? So I'll be using the metabolic language from social metabolism to now the metabolic transition. And when that happens, when even diets, even our diets, living from simple vegetarian diets, a lot of people here have moved to meat-based, more animal-based diets because of wealth. I published an article in 2012 in Ecological Economics looking at India's biophysical economy, and which noticed the change in diets. So as wealth increases, diets. So similarly, as we consume more of those, rich foods with wealth, also economies consume, metabolize, in a different way. So, and that's another story. But we not only metabolize biophysical resources, we also metabolize human relationships, right? And those relationships are also undergoing change with the biophysical system. But I won't go into that part yet. So what happens is that with unsustainable patterns of resource use or unsustainable metabolism, we are accumulating a metabolic risk. So let me break this down a little bit. So here is the idea of the metabolic risk is very similar to the circulatory health problems to humans, So let's say we go to a doctor and doctor checks, your blood and says, well, your cholesterol level, because you have been eating rich foods, because you have the money, so and now you have this cholesterol issue. So this is there are these signals, right? So there are the signals, the high, and you got to do something about it, right? And so you have the option to change your metabolism or your lifestyle, like you eat, healthier food and switch to a different diet, or or exercise, so change metabolism, lifestyle. You have the option, or these are a box of pills. You have to have that every day. And so that is an external kind of a technological solution to your system that will help you if you don't want to leave eating samosas and dosas. And so here is the box of pills that you might want to have every day for the rest of your life. But if you won't do that even, then be ready for some unexpected surprises, some shocks, maybe organ failure or a heart attack or so. So say something must be done, and that might be even costly. In the future, surgeries can be more expensive, your health will be. So that's, of course, because, people, okay, 10 years, that's risk is like 20 years away. Why should I bother now? I will look after it there. So we discount our futures as well. So, but the issue is that it's not only in 20 years. If when our body metabolism is becoming weaker, we are also vulnerable to diseases. Because we are also vulnerable to other types of risk in our environment. We're not as resilient as even, right? It's not about just the heart attack. Our physical structure becomes weak, and we are resilient to all kinds of stresses around us, or air pollution. We can respond kind of negatively to other problems, which can cascade, which can accelerate the problem because of this multiple. In systems, there are multiple feedback loops. So it's not just a linear system, right? So it's multiple feedback loops in a complex system. So similarly, so when you have similarly for islands, is that maladaptive, climate insensitive development on islands, such as import dependency and coastal squeeze, can also cause those type of kind of issues that I just mentioned. So they really magnify island climate vulnerability, right? So our analysis has been showing that when there are extreme events, whether it's a disaster or a COVID, they expose the inherent vulnerabilities within, of systems that display, they exhibit unsustainable resource use patterns. So that's what I want to talk about this type of what you call accumulating the socio-metabolic risk. So you can see that, maybe just think about the Mali example, is over time growing and building infrastructure, and the arrows are getting thicker and thicker because the flows are increasing, and then because nothing can grow forever, there is that point of collapse. So those kind of situations, we try to study how close tipping points and we try to look at cascade and so on. So here is what I do, essentially. So I'm looking monitoring these resource flows from entry to exit, but not just, okay, so much is coming and so much leaving. That's not interesting anymore. It used to be interesting like 20 years ago, but not anymore. There are more interesting things you can do with this data. So what we can also look at how the system, in terms of its stock flow combination and the service combination, the quantity, quality, and the spatial. So we have thrown into the game the GIS, also geospatial analysis, looking at and how the risk is being proliferated, being spread in the system. So it's like how a doctor can do X-rays and all kind of scans to say how disease is, kind of spreading in your body. We can also see through geospatial analysis the environmental justice issues, because again, islands are not black box. There are different social groups in there. There are rich people and the poor people, and the cost and benefit of island metabolism is not equally distributed. Some people who benefit from that metabolism, they get the best of that, the better quality of life and the benefits. Others pay the price because they live close to landfills or coastal areas where there is water that's polluted, and so environmental justice is very important, because we might think that why is that important? Why is that a risk issue? Why is that a risk issue? Of course, it's a risk issue because when inequalities, people who work with political ecology can say that we have evidence that places where there are more inequalities, extreme, and there's more polarization, those places are hotspots of conflict. There is more crime possibilities, there is more violence. When people live, there is inequalities, there's going to be reactions, So when you just let that go, at some point, people are not going to accept it. So risk. So we call it the kind of a social risk. The hotspots of conflict, and so that nobody wants. We also look at the potential for collapse. We are looking at the strategies about how can certain economies move from a more linear to a circular metabolism. So again, I'll talk a little bit more about it at the end, and so become more resource efficient, adaptive, and resilient. So this is our strategy in a way to say to build resilience. And understand more of the stock flow service kind of nexus approach. So because at the end, we all want high quality of services. We are interested in service. It doesn't matter how it comes. I mean, if I wouldn't care about buying a washing machine if I can get clean clothes somehow, So why should I need to own a car if I have a good public transport? So at the end, we care about services. So looking at it from the service perspective, and I know some of you are looking at that here. So that's the thinking. I think that's the way at the moment to think about, is not to too much depend on products, but focus on kind of services. So my computer says that I should be in India today. Okay, that was my calendar. I'm here. Just a few examples, and I'll give you just a few examples from the Caribbean, and this is Grenada. It's so this is a GIS a map, and what you see is a very interesting pattern where the red parts these are hotspots of the concentration of material stocks, the infrastructure. So you can see the concentration, right? So the whole island is there empty. Like they're very sparse population, but everything is, this is the capital, the tourism development, the university, everything is around here, infrastructure. But so now this is exposure, the exposure risk. So when there are hurricanes, so on, I mean, you can imagine that this has happened earlier, and I'm going to show you another kind of graph. But because such important services are located here, they're also at high risk. So we see that Also, 1 meter sea level rise, again, a scenario we say, what infrastructure is most at risk? From when we are quantifying, we are looking at in terms of mass. So tourism infrastructure is highest at risk. Then industrial. So you can see the economic sectors, right? So they are highest at risk with 1 meter sea level rise. This is, then again, when there are extreme events like hurricanes, that also exposes them. So this is looking at the material flows of construction materials in 20 years. So yeah, so you see from timber, non-metallic minerals, iron industry, other metals, you see the flow. Now, those who have been working with material flows and familiar with that, they will see this is a very untypical graph that you have spikes. Usually material flows are smooth going, it's rising, right? But this is typical for islands. And these cycles of construction, destruction, construction, and this is imports. These are imports. So materials are being imported whenever there's cycles of destruction. This is very unusual, this spiky graph. But if I showed it to a non-islands, they will say, what's going on here? It is very puzzling. But I showed this in Grenada, and I was giving a public talk, and there were policymakers as well, and government and other people. And I showed them, and they exactly saw the dates, and they told they were the hurricanes. It wasn't so difficult for them to understand. So the Bahamas is not very different. They had the Hurricane Dorian just came, in 2019. So we did analysis there, and again, one example, we did a few studies. This is looking at just the coastal infrastructure, and at 1 meter sea level rise. You see that basically transport would be most impacted. So, airports and seaports will be like 39%, 12%. So transport is so critical to islands. Everything transport related, because they're far away, they rely on transport, especially planes and seaports. And when the cargo comes, when you have oil coming in or any cargo, they're stored at the ports. And when there's a hurricane, which happened, the ports were destroyed, the whole oil spill happened because the oil was stored in the port, and it destroyed. There was oil spill all over in the ocean. So, so this is an example of the kind of risk that you accumulate with how you think about, planning. So, yeah, that was an example of the oil spill. So I won't go through all of that. So because of high fuel import, because they're importing a lot of stuff, so you can have the risks are price plus also spills, because that really happened with Dorian, and then now they're cleaning up. It's very costly to clean up that oil from the oceans, if ever it can be cleaned, but it's irreversible damage for the most part. So we are looking at those things, and then let's look at food. The Caribbean imports 83% of their food in monetary terms, and I would say up to 80-90% of the food in biophysical terms. Here is the graph that shows physical trade balance of biomass. In the middle here, you see this is the zero. Anything below you is a surplus, and above here is a deficit, right? You will see something happen in 1970s, that the Caribbean, from being a net food exporter, became a net food importer. Now, how would that happen, right? Like, of course, they had food, they were eating food, and suddenly they are dependent. Policy changes, trade, you switch your agriculture sector, I told you, just put your resources in tourism and other, and switch your economy, short-term thinking. Now, Caribbean islands are thinking, oh my God, we have, now food security is an issue, and nutrition is an issue, and now this, so they are realizing, but to revive that is going to take a long time, because the sector is killed. To reuse, to reallocate land to agriculture, and to bring back farmers. Who wants to go back to farming now, right? To start food. So it's not easy, and so we have been discussing that as well. And here is a study that we didn't do, but actually published by FAO, and it's again a picture. It was a SID study, but I'm showing you in the Caribbean. It's very similar data. So you see the micronutrient deficiency. So low is yellow, and then goes to moderate, high is all red. So you can pretty much see we are in the orange to red zone or islands. And so we say in terms of SIDS, it's 10% of SIDS countries have enough iodine. and only 13% countries have an availability of vitamin A. So you see, but what's surplus is sweets and fats that are above the recommended levels. And think of a system where everything is coming long distance. So fresh produce cannot travel that way. What is coming is processed food, packaged food, frozen food, canned food. So not only it brings bad quality micronutrient deficient food, it's also bringing a lot of packaging, which ends up in waste. So I'll talk about waste because waste is also kind of double there. So you are having, you can see how the system kind of becomes, what do you call, accumulate risks with each other. So I want to show you one or two examples from a study that was done. It was a major survey of 25,000 respondents, what happened after COVID. And their data was collected in 3 points in time, and you can see on the right there, February 2021, February 2022, and August 2022. So those are 3 different color codes. So if you want to read all of that from bottom, so yeah, and you see the blue one is the latest, and the blue bar is always increasing, So I want to just point a couple of things here. So they asked people to tell whether this was true or not. So almost 48% of the people were saying, I was hungry but did not eat, right? So you can imagine how the shocks can result in their well-being. The second, I would say, my household ran out of food. More than 40% people were saying that. So this was always in respect to last 2 weeks, when they were being asked. Then more than 60% of the people said, I was unable to eat healthy and nutritious food. So this, and there are more studies, and I can show more examples, but I just want to point out, when you have a food system of import dependent, that what I showed you earlier, that's the kind of through shocks, that's how you react, And let's look at waste, but I'll start with electronic waste. So Caribbean, they generate more than double electronic waste per capita compared to global average. So as I mentioned earlier, to save costs, because of transport cost, old cars come in, you bring in old cars, you bring in, you can like low quality cell phones, that the lives are very short, so they die like in a couple of years. So basically the bad quality, these electronics come in because people would be able to afford it, right? So otherwise, if you brought high quality with only few people can buy expensive stuff. So then they go into the landfills and electronic waste, so because of turnover, you generate a lot. So you can see some of that, it's rising. And so we were able to quantify if you look at the materials, embodied materials in that electronic waste, if there was a facility to extract, economic value is 546 million, of that resource. But they will have to collaborate and think about a facility to extract all that. So we did another article to show how that could work, but it was at least to show the potential and the problem, the scope of the problem. So here is Grenada, a one-way linear system, and this is typical for islands. So you see all these sectors that are generating waste. So you will see tourism is generating, huge amounts as well. So about 50,000 tons of waste per year is coming, or is 1.14 kilogram per capita per day, and global average is much lower. So the island is generating more waste because, of course, tourism brings waste. An island like Aruba with 100,000 people, they have 1 million tourists per year. So the waste is there. Plus the packaging I mentioned, then electronic waste that ends up in landfills faster. So this is the Bahamas. This is a mass balance, the first mass balance study that we did for a small island state, and to look at the full mass balance. So looking at imports and so on. So I wouldn't go into details, but I want to point to you one figure is the recycling is less than 1%. And this has been recorded. We looked at other islands also in Greece with a similar scope. The global recycling, we call the circularity rate at the moment, is about 8%. It's not great either. There's room for improvement there, but this is even further down. So back to my chicken, This is my guiding paradigm, is we have just too much put, right? And so what do we need? We need a put policy. So because so far we are always thinking about output. We talk about, oh, circular economy, let's deal, recycle waste, let's make energy from waste. Everybody, the moment you think of circular economy, everybody looks at the waste. But where does it come from? Again, from a system dynamic, where is the waste coming from? Where the leverage points reach. So, because if you start to build a facility around waste, then you need to have the waste for years to come, because the facility is built to consume a lot of waste. Then you cannot get rid of waste because you need the waste, right? So what's happening is then to look at input. Yes, it's important. Let's look at the input. Okay, that's, let's say, better for sure. But where is the input happening? Where does it come from? It's happening with the put. So we had overlooked put for a long time, And so my role is to bring this put in the core of the discussion to say, because of our put, remember the figure of Male, 50 years, and how the cycle of the stock flow service nexus, that's the put that's happening there. And we need to be thinking carefully, and we need design thinkers. We need systems thinkers too, but we also need design thinking that you are actually practicing with your new campus. The new campus, you're already from the scratch, you're planning everything in detail, like that's design thinking, right? That's you're watching the, so what you're doing is basically, with the new campus, you are slimming the put. You see? That's where it is. So you're already doing that, and that's a great example. And so I was very impressed to see your books, your 4 books that you produced on your campus, and this is amazing. Like, you have such an amazing group of people looking at the infrastructure and everything else. So slim the put is, to me, a high leverage. I'm not saying you shouldn't think of other, you must think of everything else. But where is the highest leverage? Starting design, you don't build a building and afterwards say, oh, I should add a nature-based solution here now, let me put a little tree, That doesn't go, you don't think before, right? Like all of that has to be early on in the planning phases. So to mitigate socio-metabolic risk and increase adaptive capacity. So this is my thinking, right? And that's where I'm going. So I'm proposing a 5E strategy. So, okay, I didn't put too much thought in because it all had to start from E, so somehow it worked out. But you get the point, right? So first is evolve towards a circular and regenerative economy through transformation in local and regional business, and increase the localization of food, energy, and construction materials. So localization, and this is what you're doing in your campus too, right? Local materials, everything, and so on. And even if you have to go outside your campus, it'll be as close as possible. So localize as much as possible. And regenerative, so the kind of design of your infrastructure. Expand circularity principles to the level of the island economy to include flows between sectors. It's not only about a product circularity, it's not only about the building circularity, but how does the building interact with other factors and food, and we have to look at multiple sectors, so it's an economy-wide. Most of the circular economy studies are looking at single products or single metrics like, okay, emissions. Sustainability is not only emissions. If it's emissions, then we should import, like Canada should have, people say local, we can probably have tomatoes from Spain, because they have sun and it put, for transport cost, but because we need to put energy to grow in a greenhouse there, so import from Spain. But emissions, but their sustainability is very multifaceted, it's multidimensional. So we have to look at many things. And so to understand trade-offs between the biophysical, the ecological system, the social, cultural, there are trade-offs there. So again, at a more system level. Enhance well-being contributions with lower material energy demand from the perspective of the material stock for service. As I said, the service focus, why do I need a washing machine if I can get clean clothes, right? So at the end, we need a high quality of life to be able to transport safely from one place to the other and effectively. So, so how can we achieve a high quality of life at the lowest environmental impact? So ease solution through, ease the resource requirements through green blue infrastructure or nature-based solutions, something that you are already practicing and thinking also in your teams here. And the justice aspect is very important because social systems are not a black box. It's who benefits, who loses, right? So the equity aspect is extremely important to look across social groups, across gender, across age. So all that is very, equity is extremely important. So question is, do islands matter, and what can we learn? So sometimes people say, but you know what, we can move, these islands, or there are 60,000 people, we can relocate them and put them in Australia, let's move, why bother? I mean, adaptation is so expensive. So, well, I think they matter and they have agency. So firstly, it's not about one island, they're home to around almost a tenth of the world's population, right? That is not trivial. If you put them together, it's a large number of people we're talking about. It's not about one island, 50,000 people, because you're starting a precedence and this becomes a cascade. You need to understand how this will work out for all the islands. So that is one issue. 25% of UN membership is island states. I mean, this is huge. Like, I think they have agency, right? 25%, and now they're coming together. On the COPs, those we have seen, they are coming, the big voices. It has increased the last years. Before they were not heard, but now they're increasing. They're trying to collaborate because they know collectively they have something to say. They're also nearly 7% of the Earth's surface, and they're using 1/6 of the Earth's total area because of the marine, the economic zones, the oceans. So you can even call them, they're not small island states, but they're large ocean states. You can turn the game around. Because small, small island states, but how about large ocean states? That sounds better, because they are bigger, actually, if you look at it. So, and they're huge biodiversity. Like 20% of all plant, bird, reptile species found globally, they're around islands, the hotspots. And but what can we learn from them is they are bounded resource constraints environments. They're excellent sites for understanding system dynamics and risks. So if you want to learn about what happens to other systems, I think they're great learning sites. I wouldn't say, I don't like to use the word labs, because they're not experimental people. I mean, this is not fair. But we can collaborate with them and learn about sustainability, about risk, system dynamics. There's so many things we can learn from islands. And also, we can also benefit, which is unfortunate, of course, but it's unfortunate, but there's also an opportunity, because there's an urgency. When there's an urgency, then there's a willingness to act. You can be heard. You don't need to go to an island and tell them you have a climate issue. They will say, "Well, really? Tell me more about it." So you don't have to convince them, because they know it. So they are ready to act. They are actually thinking about these things more faster than other people, like other parts of the world. So, and right up to the top, it's an agenda. It's really important. So this is, even though it's unfortunate, it's an opportunity because of the urgency to collaborate. And so my experience has been that I have never heard a no from any island institution, government who wants to work on these topics, because they realize this is important. So here is things I can share with you. And of course, if you have time, when you go for your next beach holiday, please take some of our publications with you. Thank you so much.
So we'll open up for some questions.
So, thanks very much for that, Simran. I actually had a couple of questions also, because this was kind of me in a previous life in some ways, because I studied industrial ecology before, and so what I wanted to ask was, like, I was really fascinated by that infrastructure figure that you put up, and I was wondering. Partly because, I mean, here, for example, there's a lot of conversation around repair and maintenance of infrastructure as opposed to building new kinds. And I was wondering if you had any insights from your work on islands, particularly given the huge push towards building large forms of infrastructure. Here we've got ports being built, or proposals for ports at least around, many of the Indian islands. So that was one that I wanted to ask about thinking about, also that as being a potential way of dealing with the stock question of repair and maintenance, and think a little bit about how that impacts this question of stocks and flows on islands particularly. And then the second thing that I wanted to actually ask about was this question of environmental justice. And if you could talk a little bit more about I know you spoke about it in terms of sort of the outcomes of, social distribution, and when you're talking about it, the way it's, mapping out, but also how it's linked with all of the other sort of various systems that you spoke about. Because, when you were listing your sort of 5 E's, it was quite obvious that it's, in some ways, environmental justice sits at the center of a lot of those questions, around questions of food, around questions of, access to livelihoods and various other things. And so to think a little bit about more, a little more about how we can sort of put that at the center and think more. Because there's a lot we can do here as well.
Yeah, sure. So the work on I have the microphone. So the work on the infrastructure is more recent, because as I said, a lot of focus for years was on the inflows, and we did that, and we have been looking at the infrastructure to the growth of and also where they are located and what services they deliver. So yes, you're right. So a lot of it, the quality of infrastructure also matters. So if you are building something and you're putting materials that are not good quality and then repairs, and so you need resources constantly to maintain it. So infrastructure has a lot to do with, I think, care about. So we need to be very cautious about what we are building, how we are building it, what is the future implications of it. And certain types of infrastructure can be tipping points. And I'll give you an example. In a Greek island that we were looking at, the tipping point happened with the expansion of the port. You see, when there was a small port, the only small boats could come. So small boats could bring commodities for certain packaging. They couldn't bring high volume or heavy stuff. When the port expanded, suddenly big ships could come, and that brought in construction material that they couldn't bring earlier, right? So suddenly you had possibility to bring steel, cement, and all that huge volume, and that transformed that. Like before, they used to build homes with stones. It would take a long time to build a home with stones. It was very good if it's local, efficient, but and people would help, and you would use your build infrastructure very wisely, and because it was not easy to build with stones, and it was a big thing you build. But then suddenly, with all the materials and all the workers, you were able to kind of build a lot of stuff. So you see a growth in infrastructure on the island, which was which then created more flows. You see, so this dynamic idea that is something that we are trying to. So we have been looking at that. So we are looking at more cases. That's part of it. The justice, you are absolutely right, to the core. If you see, if I had to draw a figure, put it there, but if I have to list it, it comes in part of the list, right? So, but it is cross-cutting. In fact, all the points that I mentioned, they are interconnected, and they are not standalone because they cannot be. The whole idea is this is a systems approach, and they're connected to each other. So, and how we're trying to tackle that is through, our first approach is to understand the geospatial, we call it the activity-based MFA, where the materials are going, who is benefiting. So once you understand the locations, where the infrastructure is being concentrated and who lives there, so you can map that information with wealth, with other type of demographic, socio-economic data, and you can relate it to say who benefits from the metabolism. So that's let's say one way of doing it in a very simple way. But then you can have people doing field work who can then verify on the ground with the kind of narratives. So we are mapping landfills and all that, and looking with neighborhoods and that. So it's a work in progress. Yeah.
So Simran, we have two questions online. The first one from Deepa Siddharth. Indian government has been putting thrust on Lakshadweep Islands as a popular tourist destination. What suggestions you would like to make to policymakers on designing and managing its SFS and SMR thresholds? The second question is from Chandni Singh. Lovely talk, Simran. Would like to hear more about how people's aspirations for their own or their children's lives in islands are seen and calculated in a metabolism framing. Resource flows are easier to capture than people's futures, I imagine.
Yeah, great question. And we talked about Lakshadweep, and I think similar story with the Nicobars. So yeah, I mean these conflicting interests are are there and they kind of need to be navigated. So what I've been saying that if we can show evidence of risk, and again, that's my approach, because I feel that policymakers tend to pay more attention to if you talk about uh, the risks that are being accumulated and how that can become more costly in the future. Because we use the word sustainability, and oftentimes that many of us really don't know how to nail it down more concretely. So the language part, there is no silver bullet, but it's about how we communicate, and communication is important. And I'm not saying that everybody's going to buy it or but I find that when I'm using the language of metabolic risk and being able to show in a robust manner the trade-offs of your decisions today and how it's going to cost, and be transparent about it, so that's open information. I think to start a public discourse, or to bring evidence into the public sphere. So science shouldn't remain a black box or something that people don't know, but it should be more understandable. And you have a great team here with media and art. You're doing a good job. So I think these are the efforts that I can think of as kind of researchers to explain the trade-offs and bring it into the public sphere. Because at the end, it's a collective. It's not one person who can drive change. It's a collective. Oftentimes, the best solution is not what everybody wants. Maybe it's a third best solution that everybody agrees on. Well, that's what it is, right? But our role is to so the two things researchers can think of, the quality of the process and the quality of the information. So we can be responsible for providing high quality information to multiple stakeholders, and then the process through which decisions are made involve people. At the end, it may not, as I said, be the best thing that you think should be there. Maybe it's the third best thing, but that's what it is. So, but as long as people decide with open eyes and agree, that's why we talk about stakeholders, that it's not about, it's about we all agree, and we want, by understanding trade-offs, what are the pros and cons, and we are willing to take want something, you have to give up something. So, but as long as you're aware of that, I think this is the social process, in my view, right? So that would be the one. And the second question from Chandni, that is absolutely right. That and again, I apologize. I wanted to show there's two circles, but I knew my talk was getting too long, that I wanted to show the relationship between socio-cultural dimension of the metabolic research and the biophysical. I focused a lot on the biophysical, but I do look at the social. So some of the team members go to the field, spend, like one of the PhDs on waste. She spent 8 months on Grenada, and her thesis, like only a quarter of a thesis was biophysical, and the 3/4 was about narratives. So she collected tons of stories about waste with people. She had focus groups, and she had interviews, and she had this social science background, and it's a beautiful thesis, open access. If you want to look at it, and it's I'm happy to share it. So it's a beautiful piece of work that actually gives. It's a nice so these narratives and these stories and aspirations, they give rigor to the numbers, and the numbers get this strength from those narratives. They contribute. And so my dream, of course, is to be able to do both of those, but depending on my team and the capacity I have in my team, who can do what, we ask them. So I have people who do a lot of field work with social processes, so yes, so yes, both are important, and I want to make sure that they're all covered, but it all depends on capacity as well and resources.
Mayuk Dave works in Lakshadweep. He had raised his hand, so he hasn't put his question, so maybe we should just tell him to. Yeah. Meanwhile, I'll take the next question online from Nupur Roy Chaudhary. Has there been a conversation about managed retreat, risk mitigation based migration in the Caribbean and Indian islands? Asking from a climate resilience perspective, considering both environmental justice and socio-economic independence narratives. For example, Pacific Islands have been staunch about preserving their sovereignty and have begun engaging in extensive land reclamation that has cascading consequences on marine ecology and so on.
Yeah, so that's more in, like, I hear more of that in the Pacific and Caribbean. I have not heard of retreats except more adaptation, like nature-based solutions. I think one of the big discussion in Caribbean is about the blue-green, like the blue economy. So that's big time. So they have a new center for the blue economy in Antigua, and people are coalescing around that, and also the Bahamas, and this what you call also Barbados. So the blue economy is the thing that is most talked about in the Caribbean, and I think because they're also very organized, I think the geography also, because they have higher altitude, they're little bigger islands, and so there is, I think that is still not the case, at least in my in the research that I'm doing. That has not been the priority, but they're looking at different types of adaptation through blue economy and also transforming the economy. Now we can discuss whether blue economy is appropriate or not. That is another question. But to answer this question, is that is more discussion in the Asia Pacific islands at the moment. And so one of our projects, which is Claire funded, Recover, will be looking at those things in the Asia Pacific.
So while Mayuk and Rohan are typing their questions, we'll go to the next online question from Maria Bartolomea. Do you believe that imposing restrictions on tourist arrivals to islands contributes to their sustainability, and is tourism a viable and sustainable industry for island economies, or should we allow them not to be disturbed? And the next question from Madhuri Mondal. Thanks for the great session, Simron. My colleagues and I are hearing you from Andaman Islands. So we have now folks from both Lakshadweep and Andamans who are giving, engaging with us. So this is great. We work with Dakshin Foundation, and some of us are from the islands. We would love to hear more about your work from Nicobars and whether there has been any research done or planned on the socio-metabolic risks which might arise in case we go down the development path which is getting planned. And I think
I could answer
we
that.
should
Maybe I can start with the tourism. Tourism is a big question, and some islands depend a lot. So my simple thinking is that with tourism is either you have to ban it or plan it. So you cannot do nothing about it. This is the path that is not acceptable. So again, it is I don't want to say that all islands should do this, and it's every case specific. So if you want to move away from an economy, what are the alternatives? And so tourism has an impact, but they're also important. So regulating to say, okay, how much and how, I think, I would say to plan it, and planning would depend context specific, where you're located, what type of tourist do you want, how long do they stay, do you want for shorter stays or longer stays, so there is some kind of design, what activities they could engage in, what behavior, and again related to infrastructure, because a lot of infrastructure is built for tourists, which is used for 2 months a year, right? So if you're going to build that, can that infrastructure be optimized the rest of the year? Can it be used for other things like other types of events? And so a lot of those things are there, and the answers to that would be case specific and not straightforward. But I am collaborating with some of the very top tourist and climate change experts. Thankfully, they are in my university, in University of Waterloo. They are very working on that. So I'm collaborating. I'm trying to learn more on that. So they've been looking at the Caribbean, and they so we have. I think case by case is very important, and not just say, okay, do this and do that. But yes, doing nothing is not an option. Banning is probably not feasible. But planning it well based on context and other options, opportunities, that is more resilient, that is more adaptive, I think that is certainly a way to go. I would say cruise tourism is not very helpful because it brings nothing to the islands. It just, it's a drain. So I think that is questionable. And so again, these different types of tourism need to be explored. Like the island in Greece that we looked at, they was depending on backpack tourism. So like 90%, so there are 40,000 tourists. They're coming to live, the camp while camping. And so the idea was to convert this island into a high-end tourist destination with an airport and stuff. So there's no airport. And so we got involved. So this is again the island where I worked. And we tried to convince the mayor if we were given 1 or 2 years to give you an economic, let's say, pathway towards sustainable tourism, which would still benefit from the same, you would have it would be good for the economy, but still be sustainable. So so we did a few years of work there, and we were able to show that by transforming the island into a high-end tourist destination, what's going to happen, we're going to lose all those loyal backpackers that come. They don't spend money on accommodation, but they spend money on food. And so we did also economic analysis on the spending. So we saw revenue that's you generated, that's lost. What do you gain? Firstly, the cost of infrastructure, how much you're going to build, maintain, how much money will stay on the island, as no taxes, it'll go back. People, will they come and how long? So these are short stays usually. And so we did the cost benefit of the two type of groups, and we showed that basically it was not a good idea to put an airport and high-end tourist destination like other Greek islands. And so thankfully the mayor changed his mind. So we could really, so again, tourism is there, but it's a different type of tourism. So it's not that they banned it, but we were able to show through our research the cost benefit of the different models. And so we said, why don't you convert your island into a UNESCO biosphere reserve? And then, and that's the process we are in at the moment. So we have, the application is with UNESCO at the moment. So to brand, that's the first, Greek island biosphere reserve. And so you could attract more of those, but regulated. How many you can, so carrying capacity wise. So that's an example of tourism and so on. So there's more we can discuss, but certainly doing nothing is not the path. The Nicobar Islands, I'm very happy to hear that friends are listening. Yes, I do, So I have a little disappointing story to share because in 2020, I was there in March. And so 2020 year was my sabbatical year. Imagine you work many years to get a 1 year sabbatical. And everybody knows what happened in 2020, right? So I was in March in Port Blair, and in my sabbatical proposal was I'm going to spend a few months in the Nicobars and a few months in Lakshadweep. And I could do nothing of that. So I was in a small Austin remote village experiencing islandness. so I did learn a lot about islandness and isolation, but I could not go. And my next sabbatical is coming soon. So I'm hoping that if no crisis happens, I would love to continue the work. So I still do a lot of analysis from the data I have. And you may have seen my works on the complex disasters. So I used to use a term complex disasters before I transitioned to socio-metabolic risk, because it's an evolution of my intellectual journey. So if you want to know this type of work that I've done on Nicobars, it's labeled as complex disasters. And please write to me. I'm happy to send you articles. But I would love to come to Dakshin and meet you all and relive the times of Annette and, all those years that I have spent there, and hopefully, fingers crossed, that my next sabbatical I'm there.
So now we'll go to Mayuk and Rohan because they've been wanting to ask this for a while. So Mayuk is asking, any inherent differences in applying your framework to SNIJs compared to SIDS, assuming regional autonomy is starkly different between the two? And Rohan, the focus on material flows is powerful, but it tends to downplay the agency of island societies in mediating their trajectories. What role do you think local institutions play in navigating hazards?
Great questions. Thank you, Rohan. So the SNIJ versus the SIDS, this is you will be familiar that there is literature. Godfrey Baldacchino has written about that. And my experience, I worked both like with SNIJ, with Nicobar is a SNIJ, the subnational island jurisdiction. I've also worked with the Greek island, Samothrace, which is a SNIJ. And I collaborate with other SNIJ like Hawaii, and US. I was in the US Virgin Islands as well. So their collaboration with SNIJ. And governance is an issue, because if you're part of larger nations, you're kind of more in the periphery, and so you might be treated differently in terms of, maybe those are places to be exploited. And you have investors coming from mainland who are basically controlling a lot of the resources and the economy. So the governance is problematic because a lot of the decision-making authorities are at the higher levels. But in terms of comparing the metabolic processes, um, I so from the case studies that we have done with both SIDS and SNIDGE, I did not see much of that. I think their similar patterns are very similar: import dependency, waste issues, building of infrastructure. Now, who owns the infrastructure is a different matter, right? So in SNIDGE might be in Hawaii, like most of the hotels are owned by outsiders. Most of the Hawaiians don't live in Hawaii; they live in the mainland, so because they can't afford it anymore. So I think from the metabolic process, so I'm interested in this question. So I'm very interested to know if the, let's say, the tipping points would be different or drivers would be different. So that part I haven't, so when I look at the metabolic profile, they look similar. But in terms of drivers, I think that would be an interesting thing to look into, which I think that's something I would be interested to look into. But I'm doing more and more work on SIDS personally because of the specialization of my work and working with governments who have different governance. So it's also a question of my own specialization, and not that I don't care about SNIDGE, but maybe somebody in my team would be interested to compare. Um, in fact, I did ask this very question to a former PhD who defended, and I asked him, what's the difference between SNIDGE and stage metabolic? And he could not answer. So I said, future research, about the drivers. So thanks for asking, Rohan. And there was a second question about Rohan, from Rohan as well, from the SNIDGE, and there was one more.
On the material flows, the agency.
The agency, yes. The agency, yes. So agency part is so again, that goes back to my response to Chandni, is that I did not show the entire metabolic paradigm because there are two parts of it. One is the biophysical, and one is the sociocultural, or the agency, because materials and energy do not flow on their own, right? It's not like they are flown by gravity, they are flying. So metabolism this is deliberately organized. So there's a deliberate process. There is institutions that make decisions, there is power dynamics, there is policies, and so there's a feedback system as well within the sociocultural aspect that drives the metabolism. So it is not just that something is happening with gravity, but it's intended. It is deliberate. So we're talking about social metabolism is because it's a deliberate process. And so from a theoretical and from a conceptual perspective, that piece of the metabolism is still there. And I have done that part of the analysis I've done for Nicobars because it was years of fieldwork. So in order to be able to capture those dynamics, you need also, again, as I said, more resources and more time to analyze and look at that. So for pragmatic reasons, we break our research into pieces, but at the end, they should be all contributing. And I'm hoping that with the new projects that we have, that we will be doing more case studies that look at drivers and stuff. So that certainly it's not a limitation. It's not, because conceptually, theoretically, I said it's part of it, but it's a gap. It's a gap because of resource constraints simply. But I really invite you and everybody else who is there to collaborate, because without researchers and team, you cannot do all those. In a system dynamic, we have to understand all system components. We need people to contribute to see the full picture. And so here is an open invitation.
I think the two other questions, they look quite difficult to me actually, but I don't know. I mean, I'm going to.
We can stop.
Was there one before this? One from Chandru Vasan. Can we promote PPGs, primary producer groups or community groups, to create products for creating both consumer mutuals and prosumer concept? Is it helpful for reducing accumulating and reducing imports? Can we do these agriculture interventions on islands? And the other one is also from Isaac Matthew, is about that islands are mostly out of the spatial planning discourse, and how much role should non-islanders have on the lives of islanders. So,
Yeah.
and I
So
think
these
we'll
are,
end with these two.
yeah. So again, my response would be to the first one about consumer. Yes, why not? I mean, but again, case specific, because the question is very general, so the answer is general. Why not? But in order to say what will really work and what type of products you're talking about will be different from island to island, will be different from case to case. So again, so while we see general patterns, some things I can talk generally, like I did today. I talk about general trends that we see, but when it comes to solutions, like we have to be context specific, case specific. For example, you and I can have the same diet. We may both love the same type of food, but we may respond, our bodies will respond differently, and solutions will respond differently. So our metabolism is different. Our ability to process certain types of foods. So because our body weight mass and our lifestyle, so there are multiple things. So even though we may have similar problems, or we may accumulate risk in different speeds even, but solutions also, some solution will work better for you, some better for me. So it's not like, otherwise we'll all become our own doctors. We just have to, everyone takes their medicine. So that's the thing, you see. So we need to, so I'm very cautious about putting out a very general, so generally I would say, yes, so the 5 E's I said, they are general principles. They are not solutions, they are general principles. So I want to clarify that. And with those principles, then comes the real work, is to start to then, based on real data, context, geographies, cultures, governance systems, geopolitical tensions, the climate situation, we have to start designing where are the opportunities, where are the barriers, and what can be achievable in that particular context, which may be different for different islands. So the answer is yes, but we need to look at it case by case. So the second question is,
The role of non-islanders on islands.
yes, well, I mean, I have seen that on the Nicobars, when after the tsunami, when the reconstruction, I spent 5 years, not all the time 5 years, but over 5 years, I was going there months at a time. Um, and then I saw where they lived, and how, the infrastructure, the spatial planning, how, and then came tsunami, and then all the plans for rehabilitation was actually created back in Delhi. And it was the Ministry of Urban Development designed their permanent and temporary houses. So I have pictures of those and to show that, yes, these are non-islanders who had never seen. And the temporary shelters were all made of tin. So, and you can imagine, if you have not been to that island, in a tropical kind of grassland type of situation, tin shelters are a burning chamber, So you get skin issues, and people didn't want to live in them, and rightfully so, because it's just so hot. And they lived in stills before, with thatched and split bamboo, floor, and the walls, and there was breeze, and but suddenly you have a situation. So I totally agree that. But this is the coming back to kind of Rohan's question: is SNIDGE versus SIDS? Is with SNIDGE, decisions is so far away, and this is a real problem. And so I don't have a ready answer to that, except that continues to be a challenge. And I hope collectively we can think more about these questions.
Thanks, Simran. You have given us a lot of food for thought, and whenever we come across any discussions or news about islands in India, Lakshadweep or Andaman and Nicobar, we certainly will have, I think we'll be able to read between the lines, given the framing that you have shared with us. And we hope that we can continue discussions, and maybe also form a community of people who have a better understanding of how we can cope with the challenges that these islands are facing in the future. So thank you, Simran, and We'll give him a good hand.
Thank you so much. Thank you.